Good morning and welcome everybody to the False Prophets launch media availability. My name is Meghana Ramaswamy, and this morning I'm going to turn it right over to Jim Stanford to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about False Prophets and the report that was launched this morning. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Meghana, and good morning. I'm Jim Stanford, economist and director of the Center for Future Work, a labor economics think tank based in Vancouver. And we're launching our new project called False Profits today, which is going to be investigating how fossil fuel prices and profits have contributed to the affordability challenges that Canadians have been experiencing in recent years. And the first report in our series is called Counting the Costs. And we're launching that report today. And I'm just going to walk through and summarize some of the main findings of it, and then take any questions that folks may have. There we go. So I was very pleased to partner with Aaron Weir, a very expert energy economist and former member of Parliament. Aaron and I have worked together on various projects over the years, and very glad to partner with Aaron on co-authoring this report, Counting the Costs, Impacts of the 2022 Oil Price Shock for Canadian Consumers and Workers. So the key messages in the report, I'll just sum up right from the beginning, and then I'll go through some of the background data. We use it as a pedagogical exercise to educate Canadians a little bit about how world oil futures markets work. Often it's assumed that the ups and downs of oil prices are just driven by supply and demand, and that is not the case. We will show that the 2022 spike in oil prices had nothing to do with supply and demand. It was driven by fear and speculation. Then we're going to add up all of the different buckets of costs that Canadians experience because of that spike in oil prices, and we get a honking big number. It's kind of shocking how much it did cost Canadians. Then we're going to look at where the money went. Basically hundreds of billions of dollars that Canadians spent extra because of those higher prices showed up somewhere, and we'll show you where they showed up. And then we'll think about policy responses that would help us protect against future price shocks and the inflationary cycle and interest rates and economic chaos that they caused. We'll also tie it into the current discussion in Canada about carbon pricing and whether, in fact, the government, Prime Minister Mark Carney, his decision to eliminate carbon pricing for the consumers, whether that's going to protect us in the future. And short answer, it's not going to protect us. First of all, in terms of how world oil futures markets work, we have to understand that the price of oil, the key benchmarks like West Texas Intermediate or Brent in the North Sea, are not set on the basis of people actually selling and buying the oil, the physical oil itself. Futures markets are, in essence, financial markets where investors and speculators spend literally hundreds of billions of dollars every day buying and selling paper contracts for the future delivery of oil. And only about 1% of those contracts actually end up in some physical oil being delivered. Most of them are just paper bets that are placed on how the price of oil is going to change in the future. For every barrel of physical oil produced somewhere in the world, it trades hands 13 times on those paper markets. And the outstanding issues and outstanding contracts, open contracts in those markets, dwarf any actual changes in the real supply and demand of oil. So this is how we, in our wisdom, have decided to have the price of oil priced globally in these paper markets where it's speculation and investors making bets that determine the price, not the actual supply and demand of oil. And this is important because the price of oil shot up in 2022 enormously. It rose by about 2/3 in a matter of weeks, $50 a barrel increase, reaching $130 US per barrel. And it is often attributed to a supply shock related to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which was impending and then actually occurred in late February 2022. The amazing thing, though, is that there was no change in world oil supply through that whole exercise. In fact, world oil supply continued to grow. So there was a very modest decline in Russian oil supply during this period, down really just about 5%. But other countries in the world, including other non-OPEC countries and the OPEC cartel, of course, which always has abundant excess supply ready, if and when they decide to put it out there, far more than outweighed the modest and temporary reduction in Russian oil supply. So through this whole period, while oil prices were shooting up, world oil supply was growing. And that was true in Canada as well. Canada's oil supply grew through this period. So we cannot attribute the spike in oil prices to a shortage or a supply shock. What it was the interaction of fear and speculation and all the financial trading on oil markets that took advantage of the fear and uncertainty related to the invasion, drove prices up by $50 US a barrel. They stayed there for a while, but by the end of 2022, the prices had come back down. So it seems like a giant detour, but it was a detour that had enormous macroeconomic implications around the world. And the dramatic increases in oil prices were transmitted into Canada's oil price system for all the fossil fuels that consumers buy, things like gasoline, home heating oil, natural gas, etc., and the inputs that businesses buy. Actually, businesses consume more energy than consumers do in Canada, and their prices for fossil fuel inputs actually rose even more dramatically. So this graph shows the increase in business input prices for fossil fuels, that's the black line, shooting up by as much as 100% year over year. For consumer prices, that's the gray line, shooting up a bit less, as much as 50% year over year. And then the overall inflation rate, that's the red line, gradually increasing as those fossil fuel prices fed through into the whole economy. Then, by the end of 2022, prices had come back to something like normal, and in fact were falling. And lo and behold, the overall inflation rate fell as well. So there's no doubt that fossil fuel prices, not the result of a so-called supply shock, were the dominant cause of both the rise and the fall of inflation in Canada through that whole painful exercise. So we go through and we add up 4 different ways that price shock affected Canadians. First of all, most obviously, higher prices for gasoline and natural gas and fuel oil and so on, paid directly by consumers. Secondly, the indirect costs that consumers ultimately experienced because businesses were paying more for the energy they used in their own production, and then they passed those costs on to consumers as well. For everything else we buy, groceries, transportation, construction, everything else we pay for in the economy was affected by the increases in fossil fuel prices. Then, because inflation was rising, the Bank of Canada jumped in and jacked up interest rates. 10 times they increased interest rates between the time of the oil price shock and the middle of 2023 when interest rates peaked. And not all of that increase in interest rates can be blamed on fossil fuels, but by our analysis, a lot can, about 35%. And that resulted in tens of billions of dollars of extra interest payments by Canadians to the banks instead of spending it on the stuff that they need. Finally, one of the goals of high interest rates is, in fact, to weaken the overall growth rate in the economy and slow down job creation, to recreate a buffer of unemployment in order to keep downward pressure on wages. And that happened. So employment outcomes weakened considerably during this period. And that meant Canadians were losing income that way as well. So 4 different ways the fossil fuel spike in 2022 hurt Canadians. And we add up each of those 4 buckets. So this shows the increased direct costs to consumers from higher prices for gasoline and everything else on a quarterly basis. They peaked at close to $8 billion extra in the second quarter, the spring quarter of 2022, when oil prices were at their highest, but they still are higher than they were before the pandemic. So those prices are still there. The indirect costs experienced through the business supply chain were even bigger. Because businesses consume more energy than consumers do. And that added tens of billions of dollars to costs each year. And businesses were able to pass those costs on. That's one of the reasons that inflation was high, but profits in the whole business sector remained high. Then the extra interest costs, by the time interest rates were increased significantly in 2023 and 2024, Canadians were paying an awful lot extra in interest, $12 billion extra in interest at peak in early 2024. And then those higher interest costs resulted in lost employment income, $2 to $3 billion per month in lost employment income during 2024 when the economy was at its weakest. So if we add up all of those things, we get a very, very painful total, about $200 billion cumulative cost to Canadians through those four channels in 2022, 2023, and 2024, $200 billion. And that works out to $12,000 per household. So the average household in Canada lost $12,000 in direct consumer costs, indirect consumer costs, higher interest payments, and lost employment income. And wow, that is a big number. And no wonder Canadians are feeling pressed. No wonder Canadians are feeling it's very hard to pay the bills carrying expenses like that. Now, the other part of our exercise was to follow the money and see what happened to all of that extra money that Canadians paid. And in that regard, I'm going to turn it over to my co-author, Aaron Weir, who focused on showing how those extra costs translated into record profits in the oil and gas sector. Aaron.
Well, thanks so much, Jim, and you've done a fantastic job of summing up the very substantial costs of volatile oil prices to Canadian consumers and workers. As you mentioned, the other side of the story is that Canada is a very substantial oil producer. And so the proceeds of selling oil and gas exceed the costs of buying them. A very important question for Canada is how those proceeds are distributed and used. This is a key part of analyzing the 2022 oil price spike. I think it's important to note that Canada's oil production increased only very modestly in the last number of years. So most of the change in industry revenues from oil and gas has been driven by these wild fluctuations in commodity prices. And in particular, with the jump in oil prices in 2022, oil and gas industry revenues in Canada jumped by almost $100 billion. This was effectively a windfall on a level of production that was already underway. Now, one might assume that a lot of the price increase would go to the people who own the resources. In Canada, those are the residents of the oil and gas producing provinces. But in fact, the extra 100 billion in revenue only added about 20 billion of provincial oil and gas royalties. So most of that money went into profits for the companies that extract the oil and gas. And there's a few different ways of looking at that. Operating profits quintupled from 2019 to 2022. In other words, operating profits went up by 5 times, which is pretty dramatic. If you look at the increase just from 2021 to 2022, that was another $55 billion of operating profits, about 3 times the increase in royalties being paid to the ostensible owners of those resources. So we see this very large increase in industry profits. If we accumulate it over the 3 years, 2022, 2023, and 2024, we find that it comes out to $151 billion, which is actually very close to the amount of additional money that Canadian consumers spent directly buying fossil fuel products themselves and spent because of increased business input costs for fossil fuels. So, we see this big increase in what Canadian consumers are having to spend and a very similar sized increase in operating profits for oil and gas companies. So what happened to those profits? Well, of course, corporate profits are subject to corporate income tax, and there was an increase in both current and deferred tax liabilities of about $40 billion over the course of those 3 years. So, there was an increase in corporate profits, but even if you add it to royalties, we would see that governments only got about 1/3 of that windfall profit on resources that supposedly belong to the public. A lot of those extra profits were paid out to shareholders in dividends. Oil and gas dividends doubled over the period of time that we looked at. And it's important to note that most of those dividends went to foreign investors who hold a lot of the shares in Canadian oil and gas companies, or perhaps I should say oil and gas companies that operate in Canada. It's striking that very little of this additional money was reinvested in the industry. In the past, I think we had an idea that higher oil prices were spurring a lot of development in the oil sands and elsewhere, which was boosting other sectors of the economy and creating jobs. We really haven't seen that. The level of capital investment in oil and gas in the last years has been only about half what it was back in the 2014 peak. So there really hasn't been a big boost in investment. In fact, the amount of investment in oil and gas has not even been enough to cover the depreciation of the industry's capital and the depletion of its reserves. So we look at gross investment over a gross measure of profits, including depreciation, and find that none of the years we looked at did the industry even reinvest half of its gross surplus. And in terms of employment, we see that the number of Canadians employed in the oil and gas sector is actually still less than it was back in 2019 before the pandemic, and the amount being paid in wages and salaries in oil and gas extraction is still less than it was in 2019, which is remarkable given that there's been inflation since then. It implies actually a real reduction in incomes for workers in the oil and gas sector. So it really seems that Canadian policymakers can no longer rely on the oil and gas industry to translate higher prices into more investment and more jobs. If we want to make sure that Canadians benefit from all this oil and gas that belongs to us through our provincial governments, it's going to be important for those provincial governments to improve the royalty systems, to collect a better share of oil and gas profits. And it may also be necessary for the federal government to improve its tax system to capture some of these excess profits in oil and gas, which I think sort of brings us a little bit more into the policy implications, which I suspect Jim might want to address as well.
Aaron, thank you very much. This was kind of a forensic exercise, looking back at the disaster of this inflationary spike and trying to figure out why it happened, in part to try and prevent it from happening again. And it's not just a historical curiosity to look back on it. We will face further instability in world oil futures markets, given how they function and given what's happening in the world. So Donald Trump, of course, is running amok with his tariff threats, his other economic and financial policies, and his geopolitical ideas, including potentially annexing other countries. And with erratic actions like that, it's only a question of when, not if, world oil futures markets have another panic like they did in 2022. And right now, that would set the stage for a whole repeat, a whole sequel of this painful exercise that Canadians have just been through. So the last part of our report does highlight three themes for policy responses to this to try and prevent the ups and downs of world oil futures markets from having such a negative macroeconomic impact on Canadians. Number one would be to try to insulate Canadian energy prices and fossil fuel prices from those day-to-day ups and downs on the world oil futures markets. And there are ways to do that through things like circuit breakers or limits on how fast prices can change, or in some cases being able to directly regulate energy prices. We do that in the electricity sector, and it's important to note electricity prices did not spike in 2022. So it's wrong to call it an energy price issue. It was solely a fossil fuel price issue. And in that regard, we can do a lot in Canada so that our prices are more sensibly related to true market conditions and true costs of production. Secondly, we should, if we can't prevent those oil price spikes, we should at least make sure that Canadians capture a fair share of the resulting revenue through royalties, as Aaron has noted, and through excess profit taxes levied when industries are making money at record levels from crisis situations in the world. Canada did impose excess profits taxes on the banks and the insurance sector in the wake of the pandemic for similar reasons. So other countries have done this in the fossil fuel sector as well. So there are precedents to say we'll capture some of that excess revenue and then redistribute it to consumers to offset some of those excess costs. Third, in the long run, the most effective way to reduce our vulnerability to the ups and downs and the manias of world oil futures markets is going to be to transition away from the use of fossil fuels and to re-emphasize energy conservation. So renewable energy sources, whether it's wind, solar, or geothermal, are not set on futures markets and are not subject to cartels and invasions on the other side of the world. And these are ways to produce energy that's not just environmentally sustainable, but economically stable. And reaffirming Canada's commitment to that, I think, will be very important. So I'll leave it at that. Meghana, thank you all for your attention. And any questions and discussion, Aaron and I are all ears. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Jim and Aaron. So I do want to open the floor up to questions from any reporters that have attended today. You can either use the Q&A function to ask those questions, or we'll give you an opportunity to ask live on air right now. Go ahead, Zoe.
Hi. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the triggers or the factors behind that spike that occurred and just some of the ingredients that went into that.
Sure. We had, by the end of 2021, world oil prices had normalized a bit from the price collapse that was experienced during the early days of the pandemic. In 2020, when the health emergency was declared and world economies were locked down, etc., world oil futures had an extreme reaction in the other direction. Prices collapsed. In fact, they were negative for a while in 2020. And that may seem like a good deal, but it wasn't. It actually exaggerated the instability that we experienced during the pandemic. By the end of 2021, they'd come back around normal, $70 or $80 US a barrel. Then, as fears of an invasion in the Ukraine and other global instability grew, prices started taking off. So they rose $50, up by 2/3, peaking at $130 US in February 2022, and then they stayed there for about 2 months. Then they started gradually coming back down. The triggers, obviously, financial speculators were looking at the world and saying, wow, there's some real uncertainty out there. And, to some extent, obviously, there were worries about what this would mean. But in the way that world oil futures markets work, those speculators can become a self-fulfilling force. If enough people think, wow, there's a war, oil prices are going to shoot up, they buy into the futures markets, and the demand that suddenly emerges for world oil assets drives the price up, and it can become a self-fulfilling phenomena. And that's exactly what happened. So in retrospect, world oil supply was not meaningfully affected by that invasion at all. It just continued to grow. It's more the high degree of speculative involvement. Remember, only about 1% of the actual trading on those markets has anything to do with people who actually want to take delivery of a barrel of oil. All the rest are people speculating on changes in prices. And like the stock market or foreign exchange markets or derivatives markets or crypto, any financial market ends up being dominated by speculation and emotion. And that's what happened. So clearly the invasion of Ukraine was a psychological trigger for what happened, combined with other concerns about stability in the world economy after the pandemic. but in no meaningful way did real market conditions explain what happened to that price. And that is the lesson for us. In the future, we don't know what the precise spike will be, what the precise spark will be, but we do know that this will happen again. It's happened many times in the past, and the increase in financialization and leverage, people trading on margin in futures markets, makes those markets more volatile than ever.
So we do have some questions in the chat as well. So we'll go through those. The first is that, you talked about the volatility of Trump's return to office and how that could cause another price surge. Any specific policies or trade measures that you anticipate would drive up oil prices again?
Well, I mean, Mr. Trump's causing fear and chaos and whiplash, frankly, all around the world with his, changes in direction and announcements one day and opposite announcements the next day. And we could feel this in any number of channels. Economically, of course, the tariff attacks on Canada, Mexico, China, Europe are going to have enormous economic implications. They'll have great implications for the stability of financial markets. We've seen great volatility on stock markets, for example, worried about what his tariff war is going to do. I suspect that even greater danger for oil prices is the geopolitical dimension of Mr. Trump's actions. He's talking about annexing Greenland, annexing Panama, annexing Canada, annexing Gaza. Things that seem insane, except he seems serious about it. And the implications of any of those actions, or his cozying up with Putin, around some kind of carve up of Ukraine, these are all things that could just cause a rupture in international stability. And then this is where this mechanism on futures markets that I just described, there are people with hundreds of millions or billions of dollars ready to bet at any moment in time on an outbreak of chaos, and they would see it as an opportunity. Most of the world would see it as a cause to lose sleep at night. They see it as an opportunity to make some quick trading profits. So any of those spots could cause the next rupture in oil markets. We've seen renewed conflict in the Middle East this week. So again, if any of those gets in a way contagious in the minds of financial speculators, we will see another oil price spike, and we will go through the same painful cycle. A needless cycle. We didn't have to do that, but we did it because of how we've tied our prices in Canada to what goes on in those global casinos, and we have allowed one particular industry, the oil and gas sector, to profit while the rest of us pay.
Our next question is, we will be heading into an election here in Canada soon. What are policies a new government could begin implementing that'll help resolve this?
Well, again, the conclusion of our paper identified three key themes that I think are pretty obvious once we've told the story of how this all happened. The first would be to try and insulate Canadian fossil fuel prices, at least somewhat, from the day-to-day roller coaster of the oil futures markets. And that is possible. There are people who say, oh, it's the world market. You can't do anything about it. It's inevitable. That's wrong. We do regulate directly many energy prices in Canada. And then there are other ways to just smooth out the roller coaster effect through things like circuit breakers, limits on how fast prices can go in a given period of time. Things like buffer stocks, for example, where governments build up inventories of prices to try and stabilize them. The second theme, if in fact oil prices do shoot up, make sure that we capture some of that revenue. First of all, because Canadians own that stuff, the residents of the provinces where the energy is produced. And then, if need be, collect some extra taxes if companies are taking advantage of a crisis to make untold profits, as occurred with oil and gas in 2022. The third, and I think most promising long-run strategy, will be to reaffirm and accelerate the transition, focus on energy conservation, using less energy in the first place, and then transitioning to renewable and more stable sources of energy. And this, I think, will be, it has to be a top priority for Canadians anyway because of the environmental necessities of it. But economically, there's many benefits from supporting that transition, including the jobs and investments in renewable energy industries, but also insulating ourselves against another hissy fit on the world oil markets.
That makes sense. So our next question is, Prime Minister Mark Carney has made the decision to eliminate the consumer carbon tax. Did this do anything to solve the problem?
I think the carbon tax, in a way, was a scapegoat for a lot of the anger that Canadians felt during the inflationary surge and the cost of living challenges that came afterward. Empirically, there is no connection between the carbon price and the rise and fall of fossil fuel prices and the rise and fall of overall inflation. We introduced our carbon tax in 2019, and then we increased it by an announced increment year after year after year. And on that basis, you can't explain a sudden surge in 2022, 3 years after the carbon tax came in, and you can't explain the decline back to, sort of normal prices after that. So you cannot explain the ups and downs of the fossil fuel prices and the inflation problem on the basis of the carbon tax. The carbon tax didn't cause that. It was world oil futures markets and the way we've tied prices in Canada to those markets that caused it. And by the same token, getting rid of the carbon tax, there's lots of debate about whether that's the right thing to do or not, but it is not going to protect us from the next oil price spike. We should be 100% clear on this. Whatever you think about the carbon tax, do not expect that means we'll be safe from the future roller coaster out there. It won't. And we will experience it as fully as we did before. In that regard, I think Mr. Carney's decision, which seems driven by politics more than policy, is not going to solve this problem for sure.
It ties nicely into our next question in the Q&A here. On that question of safety, do you see a scenario where Canada could insulate itself from future fossil fuel-driven inflation, or is it too tied to global markets?
No, we absolutely could through any number of ways. We could, first of all, think about how to insulate fossil fuel prices in Canada from those ups and downs. And I mentioned some of those options, and other countries have pursued some of those ideas successfully. Secondly, we could directly regulate the impact on prices and profits in key industries. So different forms of price regulation were part of the toolbox when governments were confronting the inflation in 2022, not just on fossil fuel prices, but on other essential goods, including food and housing and so on. And then, ultimately, the faster we get off of fossil fuels, the less we're going to be vulnerable or exposed to the next oil price spike, which will happen.
Since oil and gas is owned by Canadians through the provinces, as you mentioned, Aaron, is there a scenario where we could collect a bigger share of excess oil and gas revenues?
I think this is really a key point that although oil and gas are extracted by private companies, the resources themselves overwhelmingly belong to the Crown. And so it's provincial governments who are tasked with collecting an appropriate public return from the extraction of those non-renewable resources. And unfortunately, Canadian provincial governments haven't done a very good job. They've maintained a lot of incentives and deductions and loopholes in the royalty system that result in the public not receiving a fair return from those commodities. The government of British Columbia is actually pretty transparent in its public accounts about the cost of those oil and gas deductions. And in the 2021-2022 fiscal year, the cost of the deductions was almost the same as the amount of revenue actually collected by the provincial government. Now, not all provinces are quite as explicit in their accounting, but it's quite evident that royalties are undercut by similar kinds of incentives. For example, Saskatchewan has had incentives for horizontal drilling for almost 4 decades now. At the start of those incentives, it was a new technique, but since 2008, horizontal drilling has surpassed vertical drilling in Saskatchewan, and since 2015, virtually all of the new wells are horizontal, yet the provincial government is still providing them with a royalty of only 2.5 percentage points on the first 38,000 barrels from each of these wells. So this is a huge drain on provincial revenues. So I think that there is the potential for Canadian provincial governments to collect a much better return from the depletion of oil and gas. And one of the obvious ways to start doing that is to close some of these gaping loopholes in the existing royalty structure.
Thank you, Aaron. We just have a couple more questions so far here. The next one is, with the Bank of Canada's recent interest rate cut to 2.75% amid economic challenges, what are the potential implications for Canadian households and businesses, especially considering the issues highlighted in the report?
Well, as we noted, the rise in interest rates that followed the oil price spike. So remember, oil prices shot up in February 2022. The Bank of Canada started jacking up interest rates in March 2022, right in the wake of it. And they increased interest rates 10 times. Now, since last summer, they've been cutting interest rates. Now they've cut them 7 times. And, I've criticized the Bank of Canada at times, but I'll give them credit for how forcefully they've been moving to cut interest rates now that inflation came back down to around the 2% target that they pursue. So this is helping, no doubt about it. The costs that Canadians are paying in excess interest costs are shrinking, and the employment situation is strengthening. We've seen shortly after the interest rate cuts began, a noted improvement in the employment rate in Canada. So those components of the costs of the fossil fuel price spike that we documented are moderating. We're still not back to normal. Interest rates are still higher than they were before the pandemic, and the employment rate is still lower, but we're headed in the right direction. So, and at the same time, fossil fuel prices have come down, but again, not back to where they were before the pandemic. So, by our estimates, the costs of the fossil fuel price spike are still accumulating at about $5 billion a month. That's $300 per household that we're still paying. Now that will shrink if interest rates continue to fall, and hopefully energy prices and fossil fuel prices fall. But the cost is still there, and the Bank of Canada's interest rates cuts are definitely helping.
We have one last question in our Q&A. This report deals with data from 2021 to 2024. Would you say that Canadians are in a better place today?
Oh, they certainly are, for the reasons that I mentioned. Fossil fuel prices have come down. They came down pretty quickly, actually. I mean, they were only at those peak levels in 2022 for a few months. By the end of that year, they were back to kind of where the year had started. Which then, again, you just shrug and say, why did we do that? That was like a wild, painful detour. And if there was a way to avoid that detour, we would have avoided so much of the pain of inflation and living costs and high interest rates. So, in that regard, it has helped. And interest rates, as I mentioned, are falling, and the labor market is picking up. So, in a way, this is a good moment to look back on it all. The pain of the affordability challenges that Canadians have been experiencing is still there. People still, inflation has come down, but the level of prices for groceries and housing and fossil fuels are still higher than they were. And also the kind of the anger and the social division that we experience in Canada is still there as well. So this is a good moment to look back on it and say, what happened? Why did it happen? Did it have to happen? And who benefited and who paid? And that is the point of this report, is to learn from that experience so that we don't repeat it.
Excellent. Thank you so much to both of you, Jim and Aaron, for answering those questions and illuminating more about false profits. For anybody here and that's interested, you can learn more about false profits at www.falseprofits.ca. We are going to end the session for now, but we encourage you to go to the website and read the report for yourself. Thank you so much.
Thank you.